Welcome to Drumbeats, the must-listen-to podcast which explains why Indigenous partnerships are the key to securing successful outcomes in natural resource and infrastructure investment in Canada. I'm Mark Manac and my co-host Robert Brandt are joined today by Scott Munro, CEO of the First Nations Financial Management Board, commonly known as FMB. We are going to explore how Indigenous-led financial government and capacity development are unlocking transformational investment opportunities across Canada. FMB establishes financial management standards that lead to the principles of sound and transparent practices. Whether it's building financial systems, setting performance benchmarks for board members, or supporting sister organizations like the First Nations Financial Authority, FMB is setting the foundation for long-term economic growth and prosperity. Welcome, Scott Munro, CEO of the First Nations Financial Management Board. We're very pleased to have you here today.
Pleasure to be here.
Hey, Scott. It's great to see you.
Hi.
I think the last time we saw you was in London at the end of our summit.
That's right.
Our Indigenous Investment Summit, and you were rushing back to Canada. You couldn't stay to watch football with Mark and I and some
That's
others
right.
from the summit.
Yeah, unfortunately, didn't get the chance to partake in that part of cultural life in London, but it was a real pleasure to be back in that city. As we've talked about before, I had the great fortune of working in London earlier in my career, which was amazing. So it has a special place in my heart, and the conference was incredible. Being at the London Stock Exchange was pretty amazing, and just the quality of people in the room and the quality of the sessions and the whole event was fantastic. So yeah, it was a real honor to be part of it.
Great to have you and Harold there.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
And we'll talk a bit more about the summit maybe later, but why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and where you grew up and how you ended up in the position you're in today?
Yeah, absolutely, Rob. And a little bit about myself. So my name is Scott Munro, and I'm a member of the Kaska Nation. And the Kaska Nation is made up of several First Nations in northern British Columbia and southern Yukon Territory. The Kaska Nation's territory is approximately the same size as the United Kingdom, to give some context to listeners. So it's a fairly big amount of space and territory. So I was born in Whitehorse in the Yukon Territory. I've grown up most of my life, however, down in the Vancouver area, which is where I am today. I'm actually on the traditional unceded lands of the Squamish Nation, on one of their reserves here in West Vancouver. I have grown up most of my life in Vancouver, as I mentioned a few moments ago. Worked in London. That was after going away to school, of course, getting an undergraduate degree at Queen's University. I came back to Vancouver and started my what was then called the Chartered Accountancy designation, now called the Chartered Professional Accountant designation. So I received that designation after passing all the exams and trials that it involves, and went on to continue articling and gaining experience with a major accounting firm. And I had the great opportunity to work for a couple of years while I was in public practice with Deloitte in London, and it was fantastic. My wife and I had our first child actually in London, so our daughter was born there, a Canadian citizen, all the less, but has some ties maybe to that city in that regard. But have been back in Vancouver since returning from that 2-year journey in London about 15 years ago or so. I kind of left public practice a few years after coming back to Canada, just thinking, I'm looking for the next stage in my development and looking for something new and exciting. I did some contracting on my own, and while I was doing that for a few years, I started working with the First Nation government. I hadn't actually worked with many First Nations previous to that, and it was a nice opportunity to not only tap into my ancestry but really open my eyes to the opportunities and the need for professional accountants to assist in a wide variety of ways with First Nations. That led to an opportunity to actually join the organization I work for right now, the First Nations Financial Management Board. So I've been here at the FMB, as we call it, for a better part of 13 years or so now. I've had a few roles during that time. I joined initially as the Director of Standards and Certification, our team that develops financial management standards, financial performance standards for First Nations, and then certifies First Nations when they ask or make that request against those standards. I've also acted as the Director of Corporate Services and later the Deputy Chief Executive Officer. And the board asked me to begin serving as the Chief Executive Officer back last August, I guess. So just coming up to a year in my current role, and it's been very, very exciting. Very exciting.
I'm sure. Absolutely. Great to be with you on the podcast again, Scott. And I'll have to do this because they'll be expecting of us. So another Queen's alumni. We've had a number of them on the program at the moment, but
Great.
Probably more relevant to most of our audience, somebody else coming from the Yukon. It seems to be the moment for connections to the Yukon with, Prime Minister Mark Carney. We're hearing a lot about what's going on up in the north, and the Financial Management Board obviously has a critical role. So maybe you could give some background about what is the organization you work for, so our listeners over here in the city understand a bit more.
Yeah, and just quickly, I wish we could lay claim to Mark Carney. He's, I believe, from the Northwest Territory, so a little further east, but up in the north nonetheless. So it's great to have representation. That is for sure. Mark, the FMB is a very interesting organization. It takes a few minutes maybe to explain what we do, because it's not necessarily the easiest organization to initially understand. But in essence, we're not a crown agency, we're not a crown corporation, but we exist through a statute that was passed through all party support in our parliament. So it's a federal piece of legislation called the First Nations Fiscal Management Act. And that was enacted back in around 2006 or 2007. And that created our institution called the FMB, as I mentioned, but it also created several other entities at the same time, one of which is the First Nations Finance Authority that I think your listeners might be very familiar with, and the First Nations Tax Commission. More recently, there's been a First Nations Infrastructure Institute created under this act. So while we're all separate entities, we work very closely, and actually some of our services are very complementary and are meant to kind of interoperate between each other. So I'll explain a little more about what that means. The FMB's vision is around empowering economic self-determination for First Nations. So everything we do is anchored in assisting First Nations achieve their vision of economic self-determination. And that can mean many different things, as you know, especially in a country like Canada. So that starts with building capacity with First Nations. And so that's simply, meeting First Nations where they're at. Many First Nations are tremendously successful in many activities they do. Many are really challenged, however. Many are living in quite remote fly-in communities, for instance, in the north or in other areas of the country. They have real difficulty attracting and retaining staff and qualified staff. So to have a CPA on staff might be really hard for these communities. So we've come up with services that assist those smaller, more capacity-challenged First Nations. So capacity development is a real cornerstone of the work that we do. What that leads to is the ability, once a nation has put in place the foundation of financial management capabilities, they will often, and we certainly encourage them to enact what's called a financial administration law, or FAL. And what the financial administration law is simply a codified set of practices that the nation agrees to do under either its own inherent lawmaking rights, or under the powers under the Fiscal Management Act that we operate under. The FMB's role is to simply review that law when it's been prepared. When we offer some technical assistance in terms of templates and the like. But what we do is ensure that the nation has met the standards that we set around that financial administration law. And that sets the real foundation for financial management success, we believe. And and then it starts to build on every step. It then allows the nation a structure to operate within in terms of building out its financial management capacity. And at some point, when the nation is ready, they will ask us to come and do an independent review or some testing, if you will, to see if they are living up to their law, if they're doing the things that their financial administration law requires them to do, such as prepare and monthly and quarterly and annual financial statements, to have a finance and audit committee review those financial statements and other financial information, to prepare an annual report to citizens of the First Nation, and many other foundational concepts. So that's one big part. Another part of our work is supporting our sister organization called the First Nations Finance Authority. The Finance Authority is a wonderful success story. They have now issued approximately 3 billion Canadian dollars in debt on the capital markets without any government loan guarantee in doing so. And that has all that money has been raised for First Nation governments to build infrastructure, to build businesses. Our role in supporting the First Nations Finance Authority is to ensure that borrowing members meet certain financial performance tests or financial performance standards that we've set. And most do, not all of them, but I'd say the majority of those that apply meet those rigorous standards. And we will issue what's called a financial performance certificate. And it's that certificate, the financial performance certificate, that makes a First Nation eligible to go borrow from the First Nations Finance Authority. And so, as you can tell from over $3 billion now, many First Nations have chosen to do that successfully. So we're very proud of our role in facilitating access to capital. That was really the genesis of this legislation. A big part of it, anyways, was seeing such a gap in how First Nations, or the limitations that First Nations had in access to capital. So yeah, just to summarize, really it's capacity building, working in the community with First Nations at their pace and at their request. I should emphasize that all our services are entirely optional. There's no requirement to work with the FMB, but most choose to. We now have about 67% of all First Nations in Canada choosing voluntarily to work with us, which is phenomenal.
That's impressive. And do you have coverage, Scott, all across and up and down the country?
We do, Rob. We're very proud of that. If our history is that we were established in our head office for quite some time was only in BC. And so, we have a lot of clients in BC, and it took some time to sort of gain the trust of First Nations in other parts of the country. A lot of traveling, a lot of air miles, you know what that's about. But we have now offices in Winnipeg and Ottawa and in Montreal. And we have a lot of staff that work remotely in different parts of the country as well to make it easier to be with communities. So yeah, we've grown a lot, and we're now thinking of new ideas as well as we continue to grow.
Sounds like your core service is providing the, as you said, capacity building and the financial framework for First Nations to go out and do what they want to do. Are you only working with members who want to be certified? Is that, or are you doing different things with different nations who may not be ready for certification yet?
Well, it's not, I wouldn't say we're only working with those that are interested in certification. We will work with nations that may not be interested in certification. They may, for example, want to use our services to qualify for a 10-year grant that's now offered by Indigenous Services Canada. So we made the decision when asked by the Minister of Indigenous Services at that time, back in 2018, I think it was, or 2019, to be a service provider, an administrator provider in terms of testing the eligibility criteria and determining whether First Nations that opt into that grant qualify or meet the eligibility criteria. So that's one example, and the nation doesn't need to be certified to use that service of ours. Some nations are just looking for capacity development support at this stage. Maybe in time they'll look to borrow and want to be certified, but that's entirely their decision. It's our role is simply to make sure they're informed of what the benefits might be of being certified, but we really will work with nations on anything of their choosing, as long as it's in our mandate, which is pretty broad.
Pretty broad, and that's the core service. But what about some of the other offerings and initiatives? I know FMB is at the forefront of a lot of national initiatives. One was recently announced, the First Nations Procurement Authority. And I know that's brand new, but what can you tell us about that new authority?
Yeah, that's an exciting example. What it is really is an example of national Indigenous organizations, the FMB being one of several, really using their collective ability to see what aggregated sort of solutions might be needed to serve First Nations and their citizens in more effective ways. So it's early days on the procurement concept, but we are a participant in that initiative, and as I think your listeners will appreciate, we're entering into a very different economic situation within Canada. We have a new industrial policy that is being developed at warp speed. And First Nations, they will need to be at the center of many of these development plans and new forms of GDP growth. So procurement will be a big part of that, especially as we are looking internally to develop more of our products and services and to sustain our economy, and given the tariff threats and tariffs that we're subject to right now from the United States. So yeah, the procurement idea might be something that becomes very, very important. The FMB has also worked on some other interesting sort of pilot projects or new initiatives. One of which is acting as what we're calling an economic regulator. We're taking on a bit of a regulatory role, and this is for what's called the First Nations Water Authority, Atlantic First Nations Water Authority. So a group of Mi'kmaq First Nations, primarily Mi'kmaq First Nations in Atlantic Canada, have decided to aggregate their water and wastewater services into a not-for-profit service delivery entity called the Atlantic First Nations Water Authority. And we've been asked, and we've accepted the opportunity to provide some independent kind of prudential sort of oversight in terms of capital plans, operating budgets, and of course supporting the initiative, but doing it from a bit of a regulatory. So it's a bit of a pilot project, seeing how maybe our work as a financial institution can assist and empower these sorts of new innovative service delivery organizations that First Nations are creating for themselves. Another example might be creating what we're calling the shared services or support services team within FMB. And that consists of offering services at no cost to First Nations, a little bit of extra bench strength, I call it. Kind of like adding some part-time or external accounting or bookkeeping support, or maybe HR support. And I'm thinking, it can be as basic as helping and assisting with month-end account reconciliations or bookkeeping, bank reconciliations, just things that take some time. Nations might, like I said earlier, might not have the right people at a particular time. And so we're offering some of those services just to add a bit of bench strength to nations when they need it. So that seems to be very well received. We've had a lot of interest in those services. And there's a few others as well.
Scott, you've worked over in London, so you already know what they're looking for, because you were over here looking at those similar opportunities in some of the different roles you had, and you've been at the summit for the past couple of years, which has been absolutely great.
That's great.
How would either a corporate with a subsidiary in Canada or looking at coming into the country, or perhaps some of those who are involved in the capital markets, who are dealing with your sister organization or other Indigenous-led organizations in Canada, where would they come across you in their discussions, or would they just kind of sense you in behind the Indigenous nations and organizations they're dealing with?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Mark. I'm not sure if they would directly come in connection to us. It's something we're thinking about, knowing, having been at the summit now a couple of times, as you mentioned. We're seeing the obvious growing interest by investors in London and elsewhere around the world. And so maybe there is a bit of a role for the FMB to play in some regards, but it's more of a facilitator role than anything else. At the end of the day, we don't stand between opportunities and First Nations. We're not there to gatekeep or do anything other than support the nation from a financial management perspective. So it's a fair question, but I don't know if there'd be any direct contact other than understanding maybe the context of how First Nations are operating in Canada, which is an important bit of information, I think, for someone coming from outside of Canada to understand that. I mean, that would be certainly one role that we would happily play.
Any deals, Scott, that you're most proud of or want to highlight, where nations that you've supported or assisted and then have gone on to raise funds in the market to do interesting projects?
Yeah, there's several in a fast growing list of really amazing successes. And again, we don't take credit for them, but we're proud of the role that we've played in helping maybe build the capacity, but also provide access to capital through the First Nations Finance Authority. So I guess the one that's probably best known in Canada is out on the East Coast in Mi'kmaq territory. Member 2 First Nation, along with several other communities in that region, partnered with a company here in Richmond, BC, to acquire the largest integrated seafood company called Clearwater Seafood. And so what it ends up looking like is the First Nations own 50% of this really, really large seafood company. And it gave them, it basically allowed nations to monetize their fishing permits, their lobster permits, things that they already had, but that way they were able to bring those into the commercial deal. And suddenly you have a very interesting combination of forces that allowed that transaction to go ahead. So that was I think $1 billion deal. So one of the larger ones at the time. And those nations have really prospered. And it's an example of, First Nations moving away from managing poverty to managing wealth, which is something that we're really starting to see now, finally. But it is in part due to the tools available. So Member 2 and the other nations that borrowed to make that acquisition, they had to get certified by the FMB. And they came to us one day and said, "We've got this deal. It's time sensitive. How can you help us?" And we absolutely said yes. And we did everything we needed to do and worked exactly as fast as we needed to get those certifications done and to work with the First Nations Finance Authority to make that.
I didn't appreciate that. They weren't certified at the time.
That's right.
And they had to, as part of that transaction.
Yes.
Interesting.
So, yeah, that was an exciting one.
And who put the onus on them to be certified?
Yeah, I guess it was, it's like I mentioned earlier, it's a condition of gaining access to the First Nations Finance Authority. So they each participating borrowing member had to get a financial performance certificate. But really, certification, for the most part, especially our financial management certification, Mark, is driven by the need expressed by the elected officials of the nation, the governing body, around good management. They want to demonstrate to their citizens that they're meeting best practices, that they are committed to accountability and transparency. Those are cornerstone principles in our financial administration law and in our financial management system standards. So really it comes from that is the motivating factor, I find, which is pretty great. I mean,
Yes.
capital is great, and that's obviously a motivating factor when it comes to a transaction, but the long-term health and success of a community is going to be based on broader standards than that.
Yes, absolutely.
Such an important role you're playing, Scott, and the FMB is playing as more and more wealth hopefully gets transferred to First Nations as part of economic reconciliation, and as First Nations participate more in the economic development activities in and around their territories, managing that money and that wealth. It's very, very important, obviously.
I think just to add to that, with what's going on with Canada and the tariffs, as you alluded to, and we have a new government, and it's a new direction for the country.
That's right.
And First Nations have to play a central role, and they're all in Ottawa making sure their voices are heard and being listened to and contributing. And I think if look back even 10 years, if this had happened 10 years ago, I'm not sure whether the Indigenous people were as in strong a position as they are today. Every year gets stronger and stronger, as there's a whole group of both yourselves and younger people now are coming through who are in senior positions, not in Indigenous-owned businesses, but non-Indigenous businesses like McCarthy and others. It just is a real game change. So I think somebody outside who hasn't really been in Canada too often may have some connection, because we're still shaped to a certain extent by our southern neighbor when they think of North America.
Yep.
And if you're an Indigenous person in North America, in the US, right, I think you're having a different experience now if you're an Indigenous person in Canada.
Yes.
And I think that's really positive for Canada. A lot to do and long way to go, but it's exciting.
It is. It really is. Canada has actually, First Nations in Canada have a lot to be very proud of. There's no denying that the very dark past that First Nations and other Indigenous people have had to live through in this country. And this country has, begun to and has acknowledged those wrongs and the harmful effects of colonization and residential schools. Apologies have been made. Commissions have issued reports, but ultimately, we need First Nations communities to thrive. We need their economies to thrive. For the difference in socioeconomic conditions to improve, and that's really what we're looking for. But that's starting to happen now. Does that mean there are new challenges ahead? Absolutely. Managing wealth is going to be a huge new challenge for a lot of communities. It can be disastrous, bringing enormous wealth suddenly or quickly to any community, Indigenous or otherwise. So, we're thinking about other ways that we can support nations in this era of economic prosperity, and how we know First Nations will be involved in so many of the big economic activity in this country, rightfully so. I think it's their time to shine, but they need the tools, they need the financial management skill sets and capabilities, and we're certainly here to assist and support.
What else is then on your radar screen, Scott? You've got, you talked about the core services and financial management certification, some regulatory initiatives, the procurement authority.
Yes.
If that wasn't enough, what else are you working on?
Oh, just a little thing called an Indigenous Development Bank.
Small thing. You in London too.
That's right.
Level of understatement.
That's right. We, along with others in the First Nation community and other partners, including First Nations Finance Authority and NACA, are collaborating, collectively working on a business plan and business model on what we're calling an Indigenous Development Finance Organization. It's kind of a working title, I referred to a development bank. That's what you see when you read our roadmap project that surfaced this idea, this concept. The premise being we feel there's some substantial gaps in the financial marketplace for access to capital, and I'm specifically thinking about risk capital. The Finance Authority, like I said, phenomenally successful, and they will continue to be successful. They provide capital that is secured by existing revenue streams. That's the way they are designed. That's the way they're set up. That's their risk model, and it works really well. But what happens if you don't have existing revenue streams? What happens if you need the money to buy equity into a project? First Nation governments don't have a balance sheet yet. They don't have 150 years, 200 years of colonial economic expansion to benefit from. So we believe, along with our colleagues at Finance Authority and NACA, that there is a compelling argument to create a new Indigenous-led development finance organization of some sort. Would it disrupt the marketplace a little bit? Yeah, it probably will. But we don't believe it needs to compete against or limit anyone's opportunities. In fact, we think it could be very complementary because it would be a public sector led type initiative and building on long-standing existing development bank models that Canada participates in and many other nations around the world participate in, including the UK.
Scott, how would this differ from, say, the Canada Infrastructure Bank and what they're doing now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I see it being complementary to some of the existing institutions, including the CIB. So could it simply be a service provider in some cases? That's very possible. What I'm thinking of is helping structure deals, helping work, again, back to capacity development, but in a very focused sort of corporate finance role. Maybe the IDFO, as we're calling it, wouldn't necessarily be a capital provider. In some cases, it might be. In some cases, they might partner with the CIB or with, another financial institution in Canada. But I also believe there's opportunity to blend different forms of capital in an institution like this. And there's not really the mechanism in Canada to create that environment. And it's not really naturally happening in the private sector today, I would argue. So I think there's a bit of a gap in sort of the $5 million to probably $100 million deal size. I think in that area, I don't think First Nations are well served. Banks, the big banks obviously get very interested once you get into the hundreds of millions of dollars and onwards. But maybe at the very high end too, when we're talking about billions of dollars, which we will be, and we are, we're talking about major projects, energy corridors. Maybe you need something like this to create form a bit of a syndicate or participate in some way. Maybe it's drawing down on the various government guarantees that both the federal government has, provincial governments and the like, bringing new players. I think there's an ESG element to this as well, sustainability side of things to this. I could bring in that area of investor to the picture. So I think it could be a focal point to bring in and crowd in capital rather than to compete against, like I said, any existing player.
Well, that sounds like a great initiative, and as you said, it's a different ballgame because there's these new opportunities in front, and capital doesn't come always with a guarantee, right?
That's right.
So how do you participate in those markets? And it sounds like a disruption, which is always welcome in most markets, unless you're the person or organization being disrupted. Apart from that, it's a great idea, right?
Yeah, that's right. We're working really hard, Mark, to really identify how this would really complement existing financial, especially Indigenous financial players, which we have lots of respect for and want to see succeed. But it's about filling gaps and filling missing needs or meeting needs that aren't yet being met in the market today.
Great. So one of the things we've been talking to you, and we haven't had an opportunity to ask about that mask beside you.
Yeah.
And it's Indigenous History Month in Canada. It's June. This is Indigenous History Month. And I know this isn't just about history. This is about the present as well. But can you tell us a little bit about that? I'm sure.
Yeah, well, it's really it's our founding chair, Harold Calla, who you both know and was at the summit this year. It's part of his personal collection. Harold is a member of the Squamish Nation, and was the founder of this organization and influential driving the legislation as well. He's a pretty avid collector of different pieces of artwork, so we're seeing a pretty special piece here that's on display where I am today. So yeah, we're very lucky in our hallways. We have some amazing artwork and paintings from Indigenous artists, both here locally and some that we've collected on our different trips to communities. That's part of what's so amazing working here, is having the vibrancy and getting to see the culture around every corner of our clients. So yeah, thanks for noticing that.
You're very lucky to experience
Yeah.
that every day. And as
That's
you can
right.
see now, the sun is setting in London, where I am
Yeah.
today. And of course, so when the sun sets in London, it decides to come out to remind you, in the cloudy day, that actually the sun was there. So now it appears. Anyway, so it has been absolutely great, Scott, to have you on
Likewise.
with us today to talk. We've appreciated your support at the past 2 summits. We look forward to seeing you again next April 8th. And Rob, you're traveling across Canada. I'm not sure if you're in Europe or Toronto or in BC down the street from Scott.
Today I happen to be in the Toronto office. Yeah, one of those rare opportunities. And thank you again for taking the time out to remind us of the important work that FMB is doing. And so thanks for your leadership, and appreciate all you do, and look forward to welcoming you back to London next year. I hope you'll take time to take in a football game, even if it's Chelsea, again next year.
Well, I would, like I said last time, I had the pleasure of joining you, Rob. I would, you'll have to forgive me if I don't cheer wildly for the home team, knowing my allegiances are slightly north of Chelsea with Arsenal. But anyways, regardless of getting to enjoy another match with you, it'd be a real pleasure to meet up again. And I want to really thank you, Mark and Rob, for your ongoing support, for driving a really important conversation with your Drumbeats podcasts, with the summit that you co-host and do. It's very meaningful work. It's creating new opportunities, more visibility for First Nations people, so that we're seen, and that we're visible to investors in markets like in London. So it's fantastic. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on your podcast.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, Nyawa Goa.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And as you were in London, cheers.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you to Scott Munro for sharing his insights with us, and thank you for viewing and listening. Be sure to share, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite podcast channel. Thanks for listening to Drumbeats. Until next time.